And now I would invite Jami Nettles for her presentation. Can you just change the slides there? Is there? So Jami Nettles is a forest hydrologist and a manager of the Southern Environmental Research Team for Weyerhaeuser Timberlands. Weyerhaeuser conducts and cooperates in open non-proprietary environmental research topics, including the effects of forest and forest management on water quality, water quantity, aquatic ecology, and biodiversity. Welcome, Jami Nettles. Right, it's here.
Thank you so much. Have you all ever been to a conference and walked away with one thing you remember? Remember one conference that someone gave an ET number for eucalyptus. That's all I remember. One thing I remember from a conference I went to decades ago was in this conference, it's a forest hydrology conference, and they invited a Forest Service hydrologist who had retired probably 5 years before to come in and summarize what he knew to open the conference. He walks in very confident and says, "Why are we still talking about this?" And I was like, "Oh, wow." And it was such a awakening to the fact that there are a lot of things in forest hydrology that we're going back and back around because maybe we're looking at the wrong questions. Maybe we don't have the tools to do that. So I'm going to do the opposite. First of all, I'm not confident. I've been anxious about this because I wasn't sure who would be here. And then also that I think, why is everyone not talking about forests in evapotranspiration? In fact, in my family and friends, it's kind of a joke. It's like, don't ask Jami about ET and what conference she's going to next. Because it's so interesting and so important. I'm going to talk about three things: research, management, just a small amount, and then also a little bit about certification, because I think some of these implications, as I looked at what was being talked about here, I adjusted my talk a little bit to cover some of the things that and reflect what others were interested in. This is just a picture I took. I thought it before I started. Guy and I started on a lot of the same things talking about it. This is just an example of how complicated forest systems are. This is a system that has been in loblolly. We're planting longleaf for gopher tortoises. You also have a lot of standing water. You have a lot of different vegetation there. So when we think about forest, it's compared to agriculture. A lot of times you think of something very uniform, but it is the diversity of these systems and the variations are so high that really dominates. And we see that in the results of why is it so hard to predict ET. So these two things that I use, we probably were talking about some of this same concepts. We have these two things that we can't really resolve because it's a scale issue. We know that growing to the maximum biomass on a site is going to reduce your stream flow, but also that it is going to increase rainfall locally and downstream. So this has been proven at scales, but how do we know what is the right scale? We still don't know the answer to this. So sometimes when I check myself and going, why are we still talking about this? It's because we don't have it. And maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I feel like what we are seeing now with OpenET, with the other types of instrumentation that we're now going to be able to use for data fusion, for example, in-stream monitoring. How long have we had those devices? Ages, but we still haven't solved things like biofouling. How can we put out instrumentation, get measurements that we could then use to compare to some of these bigger systems? We're just at a point I feel like we are so optimistic about being able to combine all these techniques. So use this. This is forest hydrology research. Some of my friends in here will know what this is. I said current-ish gaps because I wrote this a few years ago and dredged it back up occasionally to say, what can we not do right now? What's kind of holding us back? So basically, the inability to measure important parameters that are at scale. Think about field hydraulic conductivity. How can we measure that? Such an important thing. It's important to models. How do we measure it? ET now was the big thing that I used to say, how do we do this? As we went from, individual sap flow measurements, the scintillometer measurements, all the different ways, backing it out with the paired watersheds. That was such a barrier to being able to do what we need to do in that. High cost of instrumentation. Remind everybody too, when we're talking about forests, that the value per acre is so much lower than agriculture. So some of the things that will be possible for agriculture to really get down those ET variables will not necessarily be applicable to forestry, although it's of course just as important. And so another thing is better models and parameterization with tree physiology. This is kind of the point of what I'm going to talk about, that as we have this distributed data, that we're going to be able to take all these variables and pull it together in a way that makes more sense, that we can do better predictions and close that gap between what we expect ET to be based on site conditions and what it actually is. Just going back to the basics here, you had on the Jean curve, and just I was looking through an old presentation. I was struck by the fact that, I never really thought about these variables. We know that in that gap between forest and grass, just like the question, what are all those variables that control that difference? There's a ton of variables that control that difference. And in grass, of course, agricultural management, crop type, that's the world of agriculture. And in forest, you look at all these things. Forest type and species, age, forest management. The fact that we're still closing in on those things is huge. And so in my world, the forest management is what we're trying to do to say, are there things in this system that we can get a better parameterization of and kind of close that gap in hydrology? So this are some research use cases for OpenET and this data fusion. The first thing I put is huge in, because this is what's going to help us solve these things. Why is this so important as we get these ET data at different points? It's only helpful if you know what's on the ground, if you can ground truth it. And so Weyerhaeuser, I'm not going to, unlike our environmental stuff that's all open, a lot of the management tools are proprietary. I also don't know those. That's not my research area. But I can tell you that we know a lot about what is on every acre. We have modeling that to the tree level in some cases. We know what's there. We also have the history of management. We have soils data. So we have the on-the-ground data and have been estimating ET. So now we have this other layer above that is going to give us the ability to go in and say, what happens between over and understory? What are the controls on those by species? So everything on the Jean curve plus weather, groundwater depth, that is not insignificant, I understand as well. So we have all these things now that are giving us the ability to do some modeling at scales that we just didn't have before, using what we know on the ground. Some of the other important things, I kind of went around and just talked to people in the company from in research. We have about 100 people in research between environmental, production forestry, tree genetics, those kind of things. Forested wetlands ID and models, this is also something that's really important. The world of wetlands, really in some ways in wetlands management, we're dependent on the National Wetlands Inventory. It does not have great ways to look under the tree canopy. Are there ET models we can use? I was really pleased to see some of the talks I'm planning to go to look at, are there the fusion methods between vegetation and ET to see, are there ways that we can identify some of those wetlands functions. Climate change stressor modeling, salinity versus inundation, looking at ET, are there ET patterns that we can see that help us know why do we have this mortality. You've heard of the ghost forest along the North Carolina coast, is we have these stressors there. Can we do a better job of managing forests? We honestly don't know. I honestly don't know. Something I'm trying to say, if there's a place where we see climate change mortality, should we cut the trees and raise the groundwater, or is that going to increase, erosion from other sources? There's so many things in there that we truly don't know how to manage that are within our ability to manage. Also, ecosystem services, we've talked about downwind as well as downstream users and taking those into consideration. So management, this is just on my slide, and it is just, I looked through the agenda and said almost everything, well, actually more than everything that I heard my colleagues talk about is being discussed here. So it was really, I was very pleased to see all these things were out there. So is looking to combine, kind of wrapping up the research and management part before I talk a little bit about certification. I wanted just to talk about cooperation. I mentioned data to support these. The other thing is that we have is the ability to manipulate sites. So we have a long history of cooperation. If there are projects, I know that there is more flux data than there is the ability right now to work to reduce that error. But there are also places where we can do manipulative treatments and then look at the response. One of those is, for as much as Guy and I agree on stuff and Devendra, we have a beef with longleaf versus loblolly, and that we're going to resolve on that experimentally. That as I hear them talk about longleaf ecosystems, that what we don't know is what part of that is actually ecosystems in general. The longleaf ecosystems are managed differently. It's less trees per acre. They're frequently subjected to fire. That in this limited system where there are not many, a lot of longleaf stands are managed. So they're managed for those open canopy conditions for gopher tortoises, red-hill salamander. A lot of time, red-cockaded woodpecker, that a lot of times it is managed for a conservation value. Where loblolly, typically we are managing it for dimensional lumber, for carbon sequestration, and so other things. So I have a project. I bought 4 Lycor 710s. We're going to put them in pairs where we have 2 sites next to each other that are 7 to 10-year-old loblolly and longleaf. Take those to the same management conditions and then look at and see, are we going to be able to detect differences in ET? We know there will be there, but there are conditions under which longleaf use more water. Does it have to do with depth to groundwater? Does it have to do to wind conditions or temperature conditions? So as we, kind of pull all that back together and increase our understanding, to me, that was a good example of a place where we could all of a sudden use these new techniques to get a deeper understanding that you just can't pull up an 8-year-old tree and put it in a lab and figure out what's going on. So certifications is another thing that I thought you all may be interested in, that Weyerhaeuser subscribes to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. It's the second largest certification scheme behind FSC, and is one of a newer performance measure. This one has existed for a while. The I won't read it, but it has overall includes water, wetlands, riparian functions, that we also follow the state BMP's guidelines in those. Within that, this past year, there was a new indicator, and it is a program to protect water quantity during all phases of management. So if you read down to the bottom, it says maintaining a natural range of variation while avoiding or minimizing negative effects. So while this is a big goal, can you imagine trying to quantify this? In fact, I have to leave early to go talk to, is the day for our annual audit. And they're like, how do you show that you're managing water quality and quantity to this natural range of variation? I was gratified that all of a sudden people cared and wanted to talk about forest and water quantity, but it's a really difficult thing to try to come up with an indicator. If you look at, you can go look at the standard, and it was open up to public comments, and the public comments were pretty funny, if you can imagine public comments being funny, because they were exactly what you and I would think of, like, how do you measure that? Are you trying to get credit for rainfall now? All these things that we would think, what does water volume even mean? Isn't it the same? Water flows downhill. And so those comments, I mean, it was very much the public, not necessarily forest hydrologists answering the questions, but in a way, it did make me feel better about the frustrations of that. So they did come out with some guidance, and on the left, it was specific suggestions. These are the things on the left that do have to do with maintaining water quantity as it goes through the system. Something that Guy mentioned again was flooding versus low stream flow, downwind, all these things. How do you work together? What are the good practices that help maintain water quantity? The ones on the right are the ones that we kind of ended up with. And the most important one for our first year, which was this past year, creative mosaic of stand ages in the forest to minimize changes in hydrology at the tract level. The tract level is, what does watershed level mean? Who knows? Everybody has a different, the scale is important for different reasons. But again, the tract level might be hundreds of acres. And so what I did to look at this was go in and do basically a cluster analysis. Were there places on our landscape where we had a high amount of forest in young ages or a high amount in older ages. And so using that as a surrogate, just stand age as a surrogate for water quantity. And what came out, of course, was that you have these wildfires out west, also tornadoes in the south, bug damage that kind of mess this up. So then it is, what do you do about that? If you have 20,000 acres burned, you don't want to not replant, but at the same time, do you want to end up with everything coming to maturity at the same time? And I don't know the answer to that. And I think some of these questions having to do with if stand age is our only variable for ET that we understand, we may make the wrong decisions. Whereas if we do a better job of understanding aspect of position in the landscape, that we can do a good job of replanting while also maintaining a diversity of ET values. So anyway, so back to open data, ET data and certification. The thing that worries me is back, you were talking about looking 10 years ago at some of the water footprinting methods that didn't take into account irrigation. They didn't take into account baseline data. We just don't have the accounting right yet. And so there will be this tendency, I think, to say, oh, we have these values. Let's use annual ET as a surrogate for water quality. But as we've said, it's more complicated than that. There are lots of different variables in there that we aren't there yet. So I'm going to end with this too. I really like this reminder that as we are able to measure things, the tendency is to think the less water that a forest uses, the better. Because we're looking at really complicated situations where we're trying to protect endangered species that have different water uses. We're trying to sequester carbon in different amounts in different places. There may be places that are better for other alternative energy uses, wind farms or solar. As we move forward over the next 10 or 15 years, trying to balance forest with other energy uses, how do we do the best job of managing our resources? So anyway, that's it.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Jamie. So we have time for questions. Oops.
Okay. Oh, I probably just closed mine already if anybody had a question.
Yes, please.
How is Weyerhaeuser using OpenET? Can you?
Not yet. It's not our land right now. Is mainly in the southeast. So where I am, but we're not using it yet. But I think that's where we're getting ready to do that. That we've been using a lot of other data sources to get to that point where we can overlay OpenET and use it. But the most prevalent case is going to be forest health monitoring and needs.
Can you use the microphone because we're
I'm sorry.
recording? Okay.
Oh, sorry about that. We are not using it yet, and so I'm looking at what we're going to use in the future. I'm in the southeast, so it's heading that way. And as we're pulling all these things together, we're kind of getting ready for it. But the most likely overlays immediately would be the forest health, the looking at management, where around just in general the conditions of what we can learn from planting during drought or some of those other things that we'll be doing. I think in terms of management, we will be using it for forest health, both as an indicator and a surrogate for other measurements.
And maybe this is just an ignorant question, but are there examples where it's been successfully used as in terms of that it's quantifiably equivalent to other measurement like eddy covariance measurements that are happening within a forest?
What we have done is just as the example is to use it in a relative way, that we've been using those values in a relative way, that we do have some measurement in terms of there's some eddy flux towers that we have out west, I think have been done, some correlations have been done, but typically we're using we're using it relatively to look for anomalies and to look for health issues. So in the near future, I imagine this is just going to be a much more efficient way of doing that. Before we get into some of those other questions, I suspect around endangered species will be one of the first cases that we're going to look at it to see kind of what a water balance is on a site where we have conditions. One example of that are there are places in where there is soil saturation for gopher tortoises. At the same time, they need those open canopy conditions. Are there ways we can better manage to pull the water table down? They're literally, getting it's too wet for them. They're drowning. I don't want to say that. They're not drowning per se, but their sites are drowning. At the same time, where in our right now our course ability to do that, to look at ET, doesn't necessarily line up with what we're going to need to know about that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have more questions. Yeah, from AJ.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and this is a question actually for both speakers. There was a mention earlier about scales, right?
Yes.
And it's like one of the things that we learned in the earlier discussions is that there's room to improve accuracy. And so I'd be curious if maybe the first speakers might want to comment on is annual ET in forest good enough? Like I know the first speaker kind of showed some graphs of increased yields seasonally as well, and just wanted to provide I'm just curious to hear if you might both be able to comment on.
Yeah, I think annual is not enough, right?
agree.
The seasonality is very important, right? Like winter versus summer. Most of the functions really in the growing season. Like in winter, a lot of, when I look at the urban versus forest, in winter they are same. Evapotranspir is very similar. And there are no difference because they drop their leaves, right? The ET, they all shut down. That's the benefit. So you need at least, seasonal, daily ET. So that's, maybe.
I agree. And that's how we're going to learn more about those interactions that we're talking about that have to do with weather and groundwater position and humidity and all those relationships that we don't know at a plot scale between the trees and the understory. When you lay all that over, how does that function? And I think the sub-monthly, the better, the more the better. Annually and focused around harvest and replanting has just been a result of restriction and cost, the high cost of instrumentation. So the work that Yoon did on like looking at, and you've done it as well, looking at even annual ET by age, that's fairly recent, and that was still pretty new. So it's great to have that annually, but the real understanding is going to come at smaller scale.
So, yeah, thanks for your presentation. I also have a scale question, but rather than temporal scale, spatial scale. So we have I'm with the Forest Service. We've attempted on a couple of different occasions to try to tease out differences in ET to try to understand what might be going on in particular locations across the landscape with the water budget. And we have continually run into challenges in doing that for a number of reasons. One is the spatial scale of resolution. So I was really intrigued when you mentioned the idea of potentially trying to use ET to understand the patterns on the landscape, and wondering from your perspective, what kind of spatial resolution would you need to have that have management relevance?
I think we need to do it. There's going to be an experimental component at first, and we're looking at 4 to 5 acres to plots to get a decent amount of, get away from the edge effects and all that. So with the on the ground measurements, that's what it will take. So I think we're going to learn a decent amount if they're all treated similarly. Over time, we have originally we bought and sold land in, sections, township range, and now that we've more changed our management to watersheds, that we will be able to add that instrumentation and then put it in, I don't know, because the right resolution, you can still get so fine a resolution that it's meaningless as well. But I think that 30 by 30, all that is so tempting and great that, it's hard not to just want to have that and then upscale and see where it ends up. But years ago, I would have said a couple of kilometers squared would be the best resolution below which the noise would just be so much that we couldn't really detect patterns. But I think there will be other things that we can manipulate experimentally and go smaller.
I have a question to Jimmy. Nowadays, people talk about, there are lots of paper going on, to say forest benefit, right? You increase ET, but you cool the air. For the company, they can take credit, right? Last week there is a paper in the Southeast. They were saying why Southeast they are cooling. Globally they are warming, but Southeast is actually cooling during the I think it's 1940s because there are more trees. They abandoned the tree they're growing back. They're actually cooling. With forest, should take some credit.
Well, I've got news for you that the public view of a forest is anything, whereas a farm is a farm. It's dirt that you planted something on. The forest is opposite. It is a natural forest that we've come in and put something else on, so that our internal look at those is that nothing like that should be gotten credit for, because it would have been, a natural forest anyway. So I think the answer to could we do that is we're interested in saying, here are ecosystem services, here are the things we provide. And as we look toward carbon, we need to know more about that, but it's so much more. Yeah, I don't know. I don't buy and sell credit, so I don't know, but I would think that would be a hard sell.
Okay, another question?
Yeah, I guess this is for Go mainly, but I'm curious what both of you have to say, because a lot of the work that we do here is in the riparian gallery forests. So I'm curious about the relationship we see in these paired studies between the clear cut and the control, if that relationship holds up in kind of like lowlands riparian corridors like we have here in the Southwest, the same as in the upper watershed forests.
Yeah,
It's pretty universal.
in the dry area, you probably may not see much in the dry area. I mean, the weather, you remove the tree, there are higher impact. Jimmy showed that the junk curve, it's pretty good curve. If you extreme wet area, the difference is small, but in the dry area, they are small too. Absolute value of how much ET reduction. So the vegetation in the dry area, they have experiments, showing this. Like New Mexico, they're probably literature, and they were, you won't gain a lot, I would say. In Texas, they also argument there are not much increase of flow. So.
I have a very short question as well. So are you observing changes in forest processes related to climate variability? And how you are assessing these changes due to climate variability? I think that can be for both.
You mean the over long term, right?
Yeah.
There is at Coweta, they show tree species already changed. From oak forest to liquidambar. The popular trees, they use more water, so the flow actually decreased. I remember it's maybe 20% because of a long term of a species change, because of the massification of trees. Even using their control watershed. So it's happening because of climate change.
Most of our ownership is kind of the winter area, which we're getting more rainfall, more ET, and so we do have the coastal issues. I brought it. That's okay. And so we do have coastal issues that are pretty concerning, needless to say. And infrastructure is another important part, that we manage a lot of roads that our neighbors depend on, that we have to keep. We're seeing differences in culverts and just infrastructure. I think that's one of the big things that the vendor's working on a project with that too, making sure that the infrastructure can hold up to climate change. And I think we're seeing that there first is a big indication. Also, I think there are troubling patterns of species of concern, and as they're moving, a lot of their habitat's no longer viable. So that's not exactly part of your question, but we are looking at that.
Okay. So I think. Thank you for the discussion. It was